Let's go Dolphins! I think the Miami Dolphins are hiding one of the biggest offseason stories in plain sight, and most people are too focused on the obvious headlines to notice what's really happening. Because while fans are arguing about quarterbacks, training camp battles, and depth chart projections, something much bigger may be unfolding behind the scenes. A decision that could impact the future of this team for years. A decision that could reveal exactly which players the Dolphins truly view as the foundation of the franchise. And the more information that comes out, the more convinced I become that this situation is far more important than many fans realize. Here's what caught my attention. When organizations talk about building a championship caliber team, they always mention culture. They always mention leadership. They always mention foundational players. But what happens when one of those foundational players reaches a point where the team must decide just how valuable he really is? That's the question Miami may be facing right now. And depending on how things play out, the answer could tell us everything we need to know about the Dolphins' long-term vision. Before we go any further, make sure you've already smashed that like button if you believe the Dolphins are building a roster capable of competing for years to come. And today I want to hear from the most optimistic Dolphins fans watching. Drop this comment below right now. Go Dolphins! Build the future the right way. Let's fill the comment section with positive energy and support for the players who are helping shape the next era of Dolphins football. Now, my personal opinion is very simple. Whenever a front office repeatedly highlights certain players as cornerstones of the organization, I pay close attention. Because teams don't accidentally send those messages. They do it for a reason. And right now, I think the Dolphins are quietly showing us exactly who they believe belongs at the center of their future plans. The question is whether those beliefs will soon turn into action. Because if they do, one of the biggest offseason decisions we've seen in a long time may be much closer than Dolphins fans think. Let's talk about it. Let's flood the comments section with positive energy and support for the players working to build the next great Dolphins team. Now, my personal opinion is very simple. When I hear coaches and executives repeatedly mention certain players as foundational pieces, I pay attention. Not because it guarantees anything, but because organizations usually tell you what they think is important long before they make their biggest decisions. And right now, it feels like the Dolphins are sending a very clear message about a few key players they want around for the long term. What makes this story even more intriguing is that it isn't just about Jordan Brooks. It's about what the Dolphins are trying to become. Because when organizations start talking about pillars, they're not talking about random players. They're talking about the players they believe represent the culture, the identity, the future of the franchise. And according to the information coming out of the organization, there are a few names that continue surfacing whenever those conversations happen. Devon Achane, Aaron Brewer, Jordan Brooks. Now think about that for a moment. Those aren't accidental mentions. Those aren't random examples. Those are names that have repeatedly been connected to the foundation Miami is trying to build moving forward. And that's exactly why the Brooks situation has become so fascinating. Because on one hand, everything we're hearing suggests the Dolphins want him here. The messaging has been consistent. The organization has publicly embraced him. His presence continues to be emphasized. And there are numerous signs that Miami views him as a major part of what they're building. But on the other hand, wanting to keep a player and agreeing on a contract are two completely different things. That's where the real challenge begins. And that's where things could get very interesting over the next several weeks. Because eventually, every contract discussion comes down to one simple question. What is the player worth? And that answer isn't always easy. Especially when you're talking about a player who has become an important part of your defense. Especially when you're talking about a player who believes he's earned a significant payday. And especially when you're talking about a front office that must balance current success with long-term roster construction. What's particularly interesting is the belief that Miami isn't approaching this situation from a position of desperation. The impression being given is that if another team called about Brooks, it would take a substantial offer to even begin a serious conversation. Not because the Dolphins are actively looking to move him, but because they don't appear eager to lose him. That's a major detail. Because it tells us something about how the organization values him. Teams don't set high asking prices for players they don't want. Teams set high asking prices for players they hope to keep. And right now, every indication points toward Miami wanting Jordan Brooks to remain part of this football team. The question is whether both sides can find common ground financially. Now here's where things become even more complicated. Timing. Because the closer we get to training camp, the more pressure starts building. Every day that passes without an agreement creates more speculation, more questions, more uncertainty. And that's why some people around the team believe this situation could reach a resolution sooner rather than later. Either a contract extension gets done, or the Dolphins are forced to consider other options. Because one thing that seems increasingly unlikely is the idea that everything simply stays exactly the way it is. Meanwhile, while this contract situation continues generating attention, there are several other developments happening around the roster that Dolphins fans should be monitoring. Some young players are clearly helping themselves. Dante Trader Jr. continues generating positive feedback. Kyle Lewis has reportedly had encouraging moments. Jason Marshall Jr. has drawn attention. Chris Johnson has drawn attention. Kevin Coleman Jr. continues appearing in positive conversations. Ethan Bonner is another player whose name keeps surfacing. And perhaps one of the most interesting reports involves Jacob Rodriguez. The information suggests he is learning multiple linebacker spots while also creating turnovers during practices. For a young player trying to earn trust, versatility and playmaking are exactly the types of traits coaches love to see. Those developments matter, because roster battles don't stop just because contract negotiations are happening elsewhere. Every practice is creating new opportunities. Every practice is changing perceptions. And every practice is helping coaches decide who deserves larger roles moving forward. At the same time, not every report has been positive. There are concerns about certain players progressing more slowly than expected. There are concerns about injuries affecting development. And there are still unanswered questions throughout several position groups. But honestly, that's what makes this time of year so important. Training camp hasn't even started yet. The pads aren't on. The real competition is still ahead. And yet we're already beginning to see which players are building momentum and which situations could define the future of this roster. And when you step back and look at the entire picture, one thing becomes very clear. The Jordan Brooks situation is about much more than one contract. It's about priorities. It's about philosophy. It's about identifying which players are truly part of the long-term vision. The Dolphins appear to know what they want. The front office appears to value Brooks highly. The coaches appear to value Brooks highly. Now comes the difficult part, finding a number that works for everyone. And if that happens before training camp, it could send one of the strongest messages yet about exactly who Miami views as the foundation of its future. What makes this entire situation so compelling is that the Dolphins don't appear to be treating Jordan Brooks like just another player on the roster. And that's a very important distinction. Because every NFL team has good players. Every NFL team has starters. Every NFL team has contributors. But not every player becomes someone the organization repeatedly points to when discussing the future. And when you look at everything that's happened over the past several months, one thing becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The Dolphins keep putting Jordan Brooks in the middle of the conversation. Whether it's discussions about leadership, whether it's discussions about foundational pieces, whether it's discussions about the direction of the team, his name continues appearing alongside players the organization clearly values highly. Now, that doesn't automatically guarantee a contract extension. We all know football doesn't work that way. Teams can love a player. Players can love a team. And negotiations can still become complicated. That's just business. But if you're trying to understand how Miami views Brooks internally, the clues are becoming harder and harder to miss. One thing that stood out was the idea that the Dolphins aren't operating from a position where they feel pressure to move him. In fact, the opposite appears true.